Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I do see the number still ticking up of people coming in, but we will just pick up there. I have some intro material to get through, so by the time I'm done, I think everybody will be on. So good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast, including two of our panelists who have graciously agreed to wake up and get their days underway already. My name's Catherine Osborne. I am the project coordinator for Fordham University's Taking Responsibility, Jesuit Educational Institutions Confront the Causes and Legacy of Clerical Sexual Abuse initiative, which is a joint project of the Theology Department and the Curran Center for the Study of American Catholicism. On behalf of our director, Professor of Theology Brad Hinsey, and the rest of the leadership team, I would like to welcome you and thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping notes, and then I will turn things over to our distinguished panel. So first, I just want to speak briefly about logistics. Our panelists will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for audience questions. Please put these in the Q&A. You'll see the button at the bottom of your screen. Chat is disabled for the audience. If you have any trouble sending a question that way, you can also email it to takingresponsibility@fordham.edu, which I will put in the chat in a minute. And I will keep an eye on that inbox as we go and make sure that any question I get there gets to the moderator. So second, just to turn to the bigger topic, I want to note that this webinar is the third in a series of conversations on historically marginalized communities and the abuse crisis in the United States. This is why the absurdly broad Asian American Pacific Islander topic, which covers many, many ethnic groups, but for balance, everybody's being included under this one. Please visit our website. Again, I'll drop that in the chat for more information on the last event this spring, which will be focused on Black Catholic communities, as well as for recordings of earlier panels on Latinx and Native American communities. Our initiative at Fordham is primarily focused on new research, but we did want to take this semester, as our various grantees are working, to highlight voices that are engaged in shedding some public light on these very under-discussed communities. So I encourage you to join us for the last event, as well as to join our mailing list or follow us on Twitter to hear about our other activities. Again, put those links in the chat. So third, and finally, before I get to introductions, I want to say on behalf of the panel, as well as those of us at Fordham, that we, as we are all aware, these are serious and upsetting topics for everyone, and especially for survivors. So please take care of yourselves and step away for a while if you need to. And we, of course, we encourage you to reach out for support if anything we discuss here today turns out to be especially difficult for you. Okay, so before I turn to specific introductions, I also want to add a particular thanks to all three members of this group. This is a very, very new topic for public conversation. Really, nobody has written about it, and our panelists today have agreed to share their preliminary thoughts about what we do and don't know, which is always a tricky proposition. So I am especially grateful to them for agreeing to open this conversation with us. So first, I want to introduce Lin Huang, OFM. For all four panels we're having this spring, we're very lucky to have a Fordham PhD student, and Lin is this panel's representative. He is now professor of religious studies at Siena College in New York, Franciscan priest with the Holy Name Province. He publishes in the areas of Asian American Catholicism, race, migration and theology, historical theology, religion, and intergenerational religious experience. His book, Rebuilding Religious Experience, Vietnamese Refugees in America, was published in 2007, and he is currently serving as a consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on Asian Pacific Islander Catholics. Our second panelist, Eunice Park, is a pastoral minister in the San Francisco Bay Area. She received master's degrees in theology and ministry from the Franciscan School of Theology and a bachelor's from Berkeley. She has worked in Asian Pacific Islander ministry on both the local and national levels, having sat on both the consultative committee for API ministry for the Secretariat of Diversity and the ad hoc advisory group for the subcommittee on API affairs for the USCCB. She was also previously on the steering committee for the National API Catholic Conference and is currently in the Ministry Leader Advisory Group for Journeying Together, a national intercultural encounter for young adult ministry. Finally, our moderator, Rachel Bandung, is a Catholic feminist ethicist who's presently based in the Bay Area, where she teaches as a member of the Religious Studies faculty at Sacred Heart Cathedral in San Francisco and the Graduate Program for Pastoral Ministries at Santa Clara University. She also serves on the editorial team for Theological Studies and is a founding member of the Asian Pacific American Religious Research Initiative. Her areas of interest lie at the intersections of race, feminisms, technology, inequality, and Catholic social teaching. And in her ministerial life, she is active as a lay preacher and presider, a musician, and a retreat leader. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to now our moderator, Rachel. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. How our portion of this conversation is going to go this morning, I'm going to be making some initial comments, both about what the landscape looks like for Asian Pacific American communities as we start investigating what the clergy sexual abuse looks like for us in our communities. And then each of us will speak from our own pastoral, scholarly, ministerial contexts. And because this is a new conversation, we invite you as we go along, please feel free to drop questions to us, or, after the fact, if there is something that you would like to take up with a trusted person or a leader closer to you where you are, we encourage you to do that. So just a couple of things to start. As Catherine mentioned already at the beginning, this is a tricky topic, and not least of, one of the big reasons why, at least for Asian American communities, is, first of all, what is Asian American? It's an awfully big umbrella, and we're asked to include so many different things. And even within the Asian American Catholic community, yes, you have the different groups, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and then other groups as well. And there's going to be diversity, not just geographically, but also, ritually and other things. So those are going to be factors that shape how we receive A, the information, and B, interpret the experience. For my part, coming in as an ethicist, one of the things that I'm looking at in exploring this topic of clergy sexual abuse in Asian American communities is, what does the shape of our immigration history look like? What is our presence around the US? Are we clustered in places where we have a dominant presence, such as California, Hawaii, New Jersey, or are we in more isolated places like Kansas, like Florida? How are we scattered, right? One of the effects of that is that because we are dispersed in these particular ways, very often we're going to be a minority presence in most parishes. Most of the parishes are going to be, Anglo-dominant. So I would expect that surely because of numbers and settlement patterns, we may not see, sufficient attention to these kinds of concerns in Asian American communities. The next couple of things I'm going to say are specific to Filipino communities, and these are purely anecdotal. Based on conversations I've had with Filipino women's networks, as well as ministry colleagues who are Filipino, there is the suspicion that clergy sexual abuse would more likely be an issue among adults rather than targeting children. And I don't have a sense whether that's true, but that is something worth considering. Another dimension to that is, because of the dispersal and settlement patterns that I mentioned, there's a question, as I was raising it with these groups, is this more of a white people problem? Is that where their attention is going to be? Another piece, and I think this is going to be common to all three of us, is how do our communities do clericalism? Practices of respect, practices of shame, honor, all of those kinds of things regarding what authority we accord to clerical figures, and then also how we think and talk about sexuality, in our own homes and in our own families, in our own communities. Let's see, another dimension that I'd like to add, and this is more historical, at least for Filipinos, is what role would colonialism have played, right? So if we're talking about Spanish colonization, for example, we're talking primarily religious. If we're talking about American US colonialism, that's going to be primarily political, and yet at the same time, the Spanish and the US converge into a cultural colonialism that's also going to affect how we talk about and understand both sexuality and authority. The last point I'd like to make, as we consider these questions, it would help, I think, to have clarity about what's happening in the various religious orders versus each diocese, and the information, the little I've seen, it requires a lot on self-reporting or litigation. So it's not always the easiest information to come by, right? And then also to circle back to the question of victims and survivors that I mentioned earlier, how much should we be looking at adults versus children and teens? Okay, so those are the initial things that I'd like to lay on the table. Next up, I would like to turn things over to Eunice, and she will pick up on some of the themes that I posed and develop them, I think, based on her own pastoral experience.
Yeah, so there's so much to cover. So I wanted to focus on three particular areas that I've seen in my pastoral work that are of particular concern or bear highlighting because of the prevalence, and especially the prevalence under this other silence, the sort of the cultural muzzle of silence, which sometimes is called that. So the first is the role of the priest in the majority of API communities, which is that the priest is put on a pedestal, which is true across the board for many cultures as well, but particularly so, I think, because of the patriarchal nature of our cultures. And that, coupled with the fact that a lot of the priests that come to the US to minister to the ethnic groups here come from their home countries and come without a lot of preparation or a lot of knowledge of the culture here, especially of the younger generation of first 1.5 or second generation kids. And then in addition to that, a lot of the priests, not just the priests, I should say, other religious, but also family of priests or families of religious are also held in high honor. And so many of them are hosted in the homes of parishioners. So you can see what kind of problems and situations that might cause. And then with whatever comes up in those situations of molestation or sexual abuse or is kept silent because these families have had the honor of being able to host these people. And so to talk about anything that comes up would be very, very taboo. So that's one example. Related to that, in my own ministry with especially college students, and the college students that I minister to are predominantly Filipino, and Latino. The prevalence of incest, I would say anecdotally, in the last 10 years that I've been in campus ministry, I would say up to maybe 40% of my students have spoken to me about incest. So that doesn't include students that don't feel open enough to talk to me or other people. And for the majority of them, they also tell me that it's the first time they've ever talked about it with anybody. And for the very, very few that did try to talk about it in their family, they were very quickly again silenced and asked not to talk about it. So that's the second example. And then I think the third example is not necessarily sexual, but just the abuse of power in general, especially in ethnic parishes that are predominantly just the ethnic parish, as well as the shared parishes where there are different ethnic groups sharing the parish at different times. Just the abuse of power in all aspects of running the parish, whether it's how they do catechesis or liturgy or running the finances. Often there's a lot of abuse around that. Gender roles. Some of the stories I've heard are from LGBTQ youth who were kind of bullied or forced to go into conversion therapy, these kinds of things, by the priest and by the laity under the priest. So the authoritarian and patriarchal nature of the way that the pastor tends to run these parishes. So I'll leave it at those light topics and hand it off to Lynn.
Okay, thanks, Eunice. There's some similarities between what I'm going to say or really pick up on what Eunice has spoken about. So I want to first piggyback on the idea of the role of the priest, and especially the respect that's not only given to the priest, but also his whole family. So the whole family also in Vietnamese culture also has a special name that is given to them. So that role is there. And so when one of the examples that I have is when priests are invited over to stay with the family, they have the full run of the house. I mean, so they can do whatever within the family itself. And I remember, and this was after the fact, my mother spoke about how when we had a priest over when we were much younger, that she would be very careful that he would not be left alone with my sister. She wasn't concerned about him being left alone with the boys, but especially with the younger the girls. So in the sense that there wasn't any concern about, I guess, homosexuality or that concern, but it really was because in our culture we really don't speak about sexuality, so that concern wasn't there. So that was the point to sort of piggyback on that. And the other example, especially for the Vietnamese community, is the refugee experience. And this had to do with a lot of when many of the Vietnamese who were sponsored by either a whole community or a family or a church group or the Catholic Church. Stories are just finally coming out about how some of them were really abused within some of these sponsorship situations that really haven't really been spoken about. But again, of how the exploitation of refugees or even immigrants within the different communities is something that is slowly being spoken about and something that people will be addressing. And then thirdly, I just also want to pick up on what Eunice spoke about as some of the financial abuse. Within the Vietnamese community in the past several years, there have been a lot of questions raised about some of the ways that the clergy and also some religious communities are raising funds. Some of them who come from Vietnam to raise funds for churches back home Sometimes people don't see evidence of actually building a church back home or building something back home. So they're collecting lots of money, but somehow it sort of disappears without real evidence. And so some of those anecdotal stories of how financial abuse is being taken into place or being played out among the community is something that will be part of also this whole clerical and religious abuse that's happening in the US right now. So those are sort of three things that sort of I think ties in with what Eunice has spoken about. But I also would just add that in a sense, people are less willing to speak about the abuse because of this overarching idea that the the religious, the cleric have such a respect because they're so close to God, right? And then that idea, and I think it probably runs across all of the different cultures that they're so close to God and they're so spiritual that they couldn't do anything wrong. And I get that too. As a priest, people come to me in confidence and so forth, and I can see that they're willing to really speak about and share really personal stories, and we do have that respect. So, but we also have to be careful of how we respond to it.
So let me pick up on a few themes that I see us sharing, and then I invite folks who are listening in to maybe also generate questions around these if you feel so compelled. Coming from Eunice, I'm hearing about sexual abuse, not strictly relegated to the church, but how it's something that we need to talk about, happening more broadly in families and in communities, um, and how to open up those kinds of conversations. Um, and then secondly, and both of you address this, the abuse of power more broadly, particularly within the parish. You talked about it as being authoritarian and patriarchal. And then, Lynn, you pointed out something interesting about, how when the priest gets taken in as the family's guest, I was wondering, and whether, for instance, are they treated as somebody like almost like a visiting dignitary, or is it more like they're just an honored family member, like a special uncle, right? And then, piggybacking off of that, um, are the girls considered especially vulnerable so that boys and homosexuality are less of a thing? Um, and then another question I want to tag on at this point is, and this is purely a statistical thing that I am not sure what the numbers might be, but how many foreign born or foreign formed priests are serving in US parishes, and how well are we helping them get acculturated to communities here as they go into service. So open it up.
Yeah, I don't know the specific numbers for foreign-born priests, but there's thousands. I mean, there's thousands. Even just among the Korean community, there's, I don't know what the last numbers are, something like 150 between the US, and there's a few in Canada. And this is a topic that's been talked about in the circles of the advisory groups for the bishops in terms of what are we doing to prepare or train them before they come, because a lot of times they come and it's sort of like a culture shock, and they're really ill-equipped, especially again to deal with English-speaking second generation. So that's been a topic of conversation. I don't know, Lynn, if you have anything more updated from the bishop's side of.
No, and there is, they do try to have training, especially for foreign-born priests who are invited to minister in parishes here in the U.S. But again, it is by diocese, because dioceses, they pick and choose if they want to really enforce the training or really help, and most haven't really, and I think that's been an issue. But the numbers of at least Vietnamese priests in the U.S. right now is close to 800. And those are both who have lived in the US culture and those who have been invited to come to minister here. And so there's that. And then also the religious, right? Religious women from Vietnam are large, and it's a large population. And the question of that also is for many who are come to the US to minister or to study, do they really go back? Because the intent is for them to actually go back to Vietnam and to minister there. And that the whole other, I guess we can say more of an abuse of the system is that do they really return back to the country, or they end up just staying in the US and leaving the priesthood or leaving their religious life and creating their own families here. So that question about how do they really minister, because my experience is that people will not really talk about the abuse of the religious or the priest at all.
I'd like to turn to a couple of questions that are in our chat box. The first says, let's see, true, the pastors were put on a pedestal and their family siblings, but by the same token, those priests who cause sexual abuse, his family and siblings also suffer. So how would we handle this situation? By suffering, and this is for the person who posed the question, I'm assuming when you say that the family and siblings also suffer, I would like clarity on whether you mean the host family or the family of the guest priest, because I think those are, you can take the question different ways. So if you'd like to return to that in the Q&A box, that would be great. Let's see, another question, and either of you can address this. Could you guys say something about Asian priests in non-Asian communities with predominantly white congregations, especially in rural areas?
About I guess that also it depends, and for many there has been struggle, and especially I think for the priests that I know, it really sort of revolves around sort of basic things, food for one, because the different foods that priests from Vietnam or Korea eat can be sort of offensive, right, to the white population, and that becomes sort of maybe for a sticking point, but then also cultural things of how the respect that they don't feel from white congregations, because the white community is that the priests aren't put on a pedestal, but they're almost in some respect just a servant in some respect. They're there to serve the people, and so if you're a servant, you don't need all that respect. So it moves from very basic things as the food that the priests eat, or how they culturally need to be, to use their language and so forth, and keeping close with family, to the point where they're not showing all this respect and people aren't really care for them. And so they find sort of this being disjointed, right, in ministering to a group of people there. They see them as just servants rather than really a minister to them.
Mhm. But I wonder too, how much things like racialization or facility with language might figure into that, right? So if I'm going in there as the priest, but speaking with, a thick enough accent, is that going to be a reason that this community is not going to take me seriously? Is the fact that, I might be the only Asian, let alone brown person for the next 100 miles going to figure into that? And then, just more broadly speaking, what kinds of cultural messages are the community folks bringing to the experience of, liturgy, worship, etc. So I don't think those things can be entirely divorced.
No, definitely not. And even I have that people said, oh, we like you because we can understand you, right? And so it's the fact that even if but then to that point, it's not that they completely accept me, because they say, we liked you. It's not like we're here because you're here because we completely want you, because you're here because you have to be, because we don't have a white priest to step in. So in that fact, yeah, you're right, Rachel. I think in a sense that there is maybe this very strong underlying racialization that happens, but
Right.
people are trying to be nice about it.
But
We like you well enough.
you're okay. But
You're okay.
just for clarification, not that it matters in the context of the experience, but these foreign-born, or should we say, first-generation priests that are out in these rural areas tend to be not the ones that are sent by their home countries to minister here. These are people that are in American dioceses. They're generally tend to be diocesan priests of American dioceses that happen to be in areas with rural parishes.
Mhm.
Just for clarification, right?
Okay. So I guess are you saying that they have less choice, or they don't get a good assignment?
Maybe that's a good assignment for some people. I don't want to make assumptions that being in a rural area is a bad assignment, but just for clarity of conversation. But there are also priests in other countries that ask to be sent to do mission work. So that I just want to put that on the table as well. So
Okay. Let me, and we can also return to this. I want to thread in one of the other questions. Clerical abuse and religious orders and diocesan priests, that there's a lot of confusion or less transparency about that. So to the person who asked that question, I don't have specific sources available on this yet. This is more my observation and speculation, just gauging, for example, on how the different lawsuits and reports have rolled out over the last 10, 20 years, right? So whether we're talking the John Jay report, the McCarrick report, the Pennsylvania report, and then other things released by different religious orders over that same period. I'm not aware of what those internal timelines or processes look like, but what I'm gathering is that because you're going to have to, go from site to site, meaning diocese to diocese, to request information and to follow the trail of, who's been accused, what were the circumstances, how long ago, even those very basic details. I don't get the sense, I could be wrong about this, I don't get the sense that there's a central clearinghouse for all these different reports, right? So it's a lot of legwork just to compile basic information. Let me keep looking at the questions. Okay. All right, so here's another one. How do you handle the situation of a top clergy overseas who ministers, I guess, in his home country as an abuser? So I don't know whether either of you have insight on this, but what is the process for someone being assigned to the US typically?
well,
You should work in a parish.
I can speak to the Korean church in the US, and the way that the majority, not all, but the majority of Korean ethnic churches work in the US is that they are not parishes per se, legally speaking. So they are not under the full jurisdiction of the local bishop. So that's not to say that they don't answer to the bishop in one way or another, but legally speaking, they are under the bishop of their home diocese in Korea. So they are sent by that particular diocese. So each diocese has jurisdiction over different geographical areas of the US and Canada, and of course, in worldwide as well, in South America and whatnot. But so that particular diocese is responsible for filling the pastor or pastors of that particular church here. And they rotate out on cycles of 5 years is currently, used to be 3-year cycles. So they come for 5 years and then they go back. Some of them request to come. Most of the time, I mean, as far as I know, anecdotally, they are sent and come reluctantly. But there are some that really do want to come. And in the case of Korea as a country, statistically, the number of vocations there is a lot. And so there is not enough ministry, I mean, for lack of a better word. So there, something like it has the most number of missioners per capita in the Catholic Church in any country or something like that. I can't vouch for that, but so they are sent out a lot. They go out a lot. And so that part of that is the churches here. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a little bit different from the Vietnamese community because for many Vietnamese are already here in the U.S., so there's not a lot of requests for priests and religious from Vietnam to come and minister to the parishes because many are already here as working in the U.S. or have been here because of immigrant or refugee situation.
Let me just throw in this thing that appeared in the Q&A box. So this is a headline from Kara. It doesn't say what year, but it says 1/4 of active US priests are foreign born, which seems both not surprising, but also high.
Yeah, and I think vocation among the API community is disproportionate to the number of Catholics. So there's more API or Asian vocations within the US than there are Asian Catholics. So that's why many would be sent to non-Asian parishes and communities that in the United States itself. So we have a large representation, even though we don't have a large population of Asian Catholics.
Mm-hmm. And is that true for both diocesan priests and religious orders, to your knowledge?
Yes, and also, you know, in the religious community, there's already those who are religious community that were formed in their country. And again, to the Vietnamese experience, you know, a whole congregation of Vietnamese priests came in 1975 when they escaped the war and set up the Congregation of Mary Co-Redemptrix in Missouri, that holds, you know, the annual now Marian Day celebration that gathers over thousands, you know, 50, 60,000 Vietnamese across the country and the world every year now. And so that community draws a lot of vocation and also sends out priests to minister throughout the United States and the world because they've grown so much and have such great support from the people. So.
I will say this, though, again, anecdotally, goes without saying, but my sense is that the call to diocesan priesthood is a little bit stronger among the API community, among the men, than to religious life because of the salary aspect and supporting families. I've heard that over and over. Not that, you know, I don't know that that's not a factor for any other people, you know, thinking about vocation, religious vocation, but I have heard it verbalized, let's say.
Yeah, and I have too. And it's a way to pull oneself out of poverty, right?
Wow.
And also raise one out of the class situation.
So-
and so you get more money, you get away from, you get an education. And so for many religious communities in Vietnam, there's wait lists. And they don't have room to bring in new members and so forth into their community. So there is that sense that it is a way to get out. But there are also those who are truly there because of a spiritual and religious calling. So you have both of that being sort of intention, but I think it's a good tension where that continues to be played out within the community.
I'm talking about more, I think that's true, obviously, but I'm talking more about when they're discerning whether to go into diocesan priesthood or religious priesthood, that the paycheck is the difference in the filial duties, financial duties, is what I mean.
So how much
To
of
their
a difference are you
family then, right?
typically talking about?
Diocesan they get a regular paycheck, and I think it depends on the diocese.
Right.
It's certainly not Google Pay, but it's not religious life pay. It's not $150 a month.
But their
So
family would still require them to support them. So if a priest happened to be the oldest son, right, he would still have to take care of the family no matter what happens. And so there is that sense of that filial piety that's placed on to the priest or the religious too. I mean, both religious women and I've heard said they still feel responsible for their family, and whatever they can do to help support their family is important. So there, yeah, that tension, you're right. If they could make more money, then be able to help their family better.
I want to tee you guys up for two questions. One is more pastorally oriented, and then the other is Atlanta. Okay. So let me bundle the pastoral ones together, and I'll pull it this way. It says, I think the tendency in Asian families in general to keep the family secret is very important. And the writer admits that she's painting in broad brushstrokes. So if abuse happens, especially by a member of the clergy, her experience is that the family keeps it very quiet and would not make it publicly known. So how can we help API families have these difficult conversations about abuse, power, sexuality, etc., and report things more readily when we do come across these instances?
that's what we're trying to do.
I mean, other than the obvious that it is going to be a long trajectory, cultivation of, what's permissible to discuss in community, outside of family.
Yeah, it'll be building trust, right? But then we are, at least within the Asian communities, we have the experience of people always talk around the question or talk around the issue, right? And so you can't really ever ask it directly, but you can sort of indirectly approach it, and that would be the way of sort of drawing out the conversation so that you build these ongoing relationship rather than going in directly. Because you can't just have someone come in, as an ethnographer or an anthropologist or a sociologist asking questions without first building that relationship, because people will walk around the question. And in my examples, even with my parents, because I asked them, it took them years to really say, oh yeah, we noticed some of these things in Vietnam when we were growing up, that some people would say, let's not, get close to that priest, or there's some issues around them. And of course, it turned out that they were, the gossip was that they were abusing people or abusing children, but it was the sort of that indirect sort of conversation. And I think that's it, not the best approach, but it's the approach that works within the community, I think.
I think on the ground, besides the obvious ones of speaking out and in public and trying to destigmatize things, I think practical things like people going into full-time ministry, for example, so that that in another 5 or 10 years, that when you go to a campus ministers gathering of 600 people, I'm not the only East Asian person in the room. That when you go to these national gatherings, that there is more API representation, and to normalize people doing ministry for a living. I think it's happening slowly, little by little.
Very slowly.
But supporting that, scholarship funds for people to study theology, like lay people to study theology, so that you don't have to go into religious life to be able to study this stuff. Support from the bottom, destigmatizing, talking about it.
Mhm. Are you guys ready for the hot question? Yeah, you are. Okay. All right. So these are two questions that I'm going to thread together about Atlanta specifically. So this one says, with growing wider conversation about anti-Asian racism and sexism in the wake of the mass shooting in Atlanta, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the stereotypes imposed from outside Asian Catholic communities might complicate our ability to respond to clerical abuses within Asian Catholic communities. That's one part. And then the second side, let me scroll down. It says, how might the sexualization of Asian American women play a role in abuse in the church? Right. And this second half of the question that I'm piecing together, this goes back to my earlier remark about Asian American adults possibly being at bigger risk of abuse than children. I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say that adults are more at risk, but I'm saying we would be more likely to hear about what's happening to adults than to children, I think. Again, just my intuition about what that kind of community conversation might look like. But it would be worth studying for sure. So either of you have any input on this?
Father, would you like to speak to this?
Well, I think your point, Rachel, about where abuse, the reporting would be with an adult. I think also from my experience, what I've heard is that mainly the abuse is mainly with women, right? Where priests take advantage of the care that are given to them by women who, and especially within Vietnamese community, the women are the ones that really take care of the church. They're the ones that are there, and I think that's across most cultures, is that women are more active within the parishes, and many priests either who feel out of place are lonely, or just sense that they're getting attention, that they're going to be in it. And I think what I know within the Vietnamese community, most of the abuse have come of taking advantage of adults. The question of Atlanta, I think the ongoing sort of just the climate in the U.S. with not only the pandemic, but the ongoing sort of racialization and racism that has occurred is just culminated in these major acts, which continues, I think will continue to occur. I know that even with students that I am working with, feel, they don't feel even safe on their own campuses because they know other students will attack them or say something or tell them to go home or still question who they are. And most of these are coming from students who are, studying here from Asia, but also students who have been born here who still get the question, where are you from? So I think what Atlanta has sort of exposed, not only is this underlying sort of racism and hatred of Asian, but it continues to expose the idea where well, Asians are never fully accepted, even if we're citizens and been in the U.S. for many years and working in respectable places, or even as priests or religious. We're either, oh, how long are you going to be here? How long are you going to be with us? It's nice for you to come and minister, but but do you do the same way back in your home country? Are you really practicing your Catholicism, or are you you still delve into your indigenous religion or Buddhism or something like that? Even I've been asked this, how long have you been Catholic? I mean, even as a priest, I've been asked that. So that whole sense of being forever foreigner really gets exposed now, and I think it also runs within the church. And again, working with the USCCB, I see that the years that the API community have advocated for leadership representation, a representation in leadership from the communities have really gone sort of unanswered. You know, we've gotten a few people in there, but it's taken years of work and really advocating for that. And so that whole sense of not being accepted, not being part of the community, it just gets heightened by what has happened in Atlanta.
All right, you ready for the last question, you guys? Okay, so again, I'm threading two questions here, but both have to do with formation and the community you're serving. So one, very simply says, what advice do you have for those who want to study clergy sexual violence in AAPI contexts, especially as you run into cultural walls, taboos, silences, etc. And then related to that, what about, it says, what about API women being allowed to minister in their own country or here in the US? And what are the opportunities for women who want to do ministry? Because, so much of the focus, I guess, understandably in a way, has been on male leadership, clergy, etc. So from y'all's perspectives, how might you respond to this question of formation and pastoral accessibility? I know, Eunice, you did a little bit with this earlier in the thread.
Yeah, I'll leave the scholarship question to both the scholars, the academics. I think just in terms of women, I will just answer for all women everywhere. I think what's been helpful for me has been studying theology, because it opens to having letters after your name always helps, especially in the API community. We like we like letters. So that has certainly opened up a few more doors than might have otherwise been. It still doesn't open all the doors, because according to my dad, I couldn't even make it as a nun. So sort of still a failed Catholic. So I think study and yes, that helps. And again, supporting each other, peer supports in terms of women's networks and finding openings for each other, whether it's, God forbid, being able to give a homily at a parish sometime, or encouraging others to support women in any way that we can, while still working within the confines and the rules of the church and being creative about it.
Let me just dip into this one very quickly, because the questioner was asking about studying questions of sexual violence. I would say, if you're looking at it as more of a scholarly endeavor, it would be nice to do it in one of the practical theology fields, I think, such as pastoral counseling, but with a solid background in both feminist studies in religion, as well as a grounding in kind of the ethnic studies landscape here in the US. So you've got to bring multiple threads together, I think. I don't know, Lynn, did you want to throw in on this?
I would just add that I think part of this conversation, of the conversation among minority community, is that we really need allies, because this is a tough conversation, especially about abuse, and it draws on issues that communities are not willing to talk about. But if there is a sense where allies are there to help us, right, to engage in this conversation and to draw out what has worked in the community, because it's an issue that we've been saying. It's about, people don't want to expose bad things about already being a minority, being not fully accepted, being a foreigner, being an immigrant. Do you want to expose something else that's bad about your community, or is seen as bad?
Okay.
Right, and learning from those that have come before in other ethnic communities, from our African American sisters and brothers, and and learning from those that have done that work.
All right, at this point, I'd like to turn things over back to Catherine.
Hopefully I'm actually back.
Okay.
So thank you guys so much. I'm just, we have just a few more minutes left, and I am just hoping that everyone can give sort of one last thought to the audience, and then we'll wrap it up. So maybe, Lynn, I'm looking at you, so maybe we can start with you.
I'll just pick up what I had said. I think this effort to really be transparent and being inclusive and open in our church. It includes everyone engaged in this conversation, because it's not just one community that has this issue, as we're finding out that all the communities have this issue of clerical abuse, and clerical abuse that runs the gamut, as we see, not only for children, adults, and financial, but it's just a clericalism that has shaped our church that we also need to tackle in this.
Thanks. Eunice?
Yeah, I would say the topic of clerical abuse, sexual abuse certainly crosses lines with all kinds of other things and all kinds of other topics in pastoral ministry. And as somebody who is sort of on the ground working, sometimes it could be really challenging, especially working in an ethnic community. And so for me, I've just been extremely blessed to have these allies, but also just friends. Lynn and Rachel are both, it just happened to be this way. It's not like we planned it, but happen to be very good friends and have been a great support for me as a lay woman working in this field. So I encourage people to develop these networks.
Rachel?
Just a few things. So to those of you who post questions in the Q&A box, but we didn't get to them, I apologize. Your questions are nonetheless rich and still worth asking. So I invite you to continue these conversations again, either with us or among each other. Just to pick up on clergy sexual abuse specifically, I'd like to say, you know, like we've been saying throughout the whole program, that yes, this is a very rudimentary conversation. We really don't know yet what we don't know. So we're relying on these networks and our contacts and our conversations to kind of, to develop the body of knowledge, number one, but then also number two, to make the conversations possible and acceptable and palatable, also. So I think those are twin tracks that can happen. As a side note to this, and because I was involved in a program for this last year, just a side plug for those of you who have not yet seen the PBS documentary on Asian Americans, which was premiered last spring during Asian American History Month. It is re-airing, I think, starting next weekend nationally, and I don't know if it was previously planned, or or it's just maybe a quick response to the events in Atlanta. The documentary itself doesn't do a whole lot with religion, but it does give you a really great landscape as to the different communities who are present here in the US. So if nothing else, go learn a little more and just check your local PBS for listings on that.
Absolutely. Okay. So we are just about at time. So I just want to echo Rachel's thanks for everyone's questions, even those that we didn't get to. We will, in fact, have all of these questions. And so some of you we may be able to reach out to answer some of these. But we also really encourage you to keep talking amongst yourselves, amongst your communities. We're very grateful for I'm especially grateful again for our panelists for being willing to put themselves out there and open this conversation up. And I really hope that it is going to be able to spark more conversation and more research both on a pastoral level and on an academic level, because now I can't, it was only a minute ago, but one of you said it's two tracks that work together, and I think that's very true. And yeah, so let me thank you all again for being here and invite you to follow us on Twitter. I'll be posting the video record of this conversation in the next day or two. And then again, we have one more event coming up in this series, so hope some of you will be able to join us for that too. And wish the panelists could all hear everybody's applause, but on behalf of our team at Fordham, thank you again, and everybody take care of yourselves out there. All right.